This is DW News. We are streaming live from Berlin. I'm Melissa Chan. President Donald Trump warned that the U.S. will, quote, obliterate power plants in Iran if the Islamic Republic doesn't fully open the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours. Iran says the vital waterway remains open to all shipping except vessels linked to Iran's, quote, enemies. The U.S. military says Tehran's ability to threaten the strait has been, quote, degraded after this week's strikes. The ongoing standoff has sent crude oil prices soaring. And Iranian missile strikes on 2 towns in southern Israel have wounded more than 100 people, at least 10 seriously. The strikes on Dimona and Arad are the closest Iranian strikes to Israel's main nuclear facility yet, less than 15 kilometers away. Now, we have been rolling these live updates out since the start of the U.S.-Israel war with Iran, and very often it's been about the latest bunch of missiles hitting some target in the Middle East, as we've just talked about. People often talk about the fog of war, and of course that means something specific for soldiers on the ground. But for people who follow the news, there is also a bit of a fog, too. The war is confusing. Trump makes a statement, everyone reacts. Tehran says something, or one of the Gulf countries say something, and we chase the news. Well, we're going to take a step back today to examine a global leader who is the moral authority to the world's 1.4 billion Catholics, but also to billions more who respects what he says. We have an interesting geopolitical situation at the moment where arguably the most powerful leader in the world, head of the sole superpower, the United States, that's Donald Trump, has an American counterpoint, a voice of conscience in the first American pontiff, Pope Leo XIV. I want to start by sharing a comment from him about the fighting in the Middle East. Have a listen.
Dear brothers and sisters, for 2 weeks now, the people of the Middle East have been suffering the atrocious violence of war. Thousands of innocent people have been killed, and many more have been forced to abandon their homes. I renew my prayerful closeness to all those who have lost their loved ones in the attacks that have struck schools, hospitals, and residential areas. The situation in Lebanon is a cause of great concern. I hope for paths of dialogue that can support the country's authorities in implementing lasting solutions to the ongoing severe crisis for the common good of all Lebanese people. On behalf of the Christians of the Middle East and all men and women of goodwill, I appeal to those responsible for this conflict. Ceasefire. Reopen paths of dialogue.
So the Pope there calling for a ceasefire, but President Trump, when asked about the possibility of a ceasefire, said that was not going to happen. He was not interested in one. What more has the Pope said about Iran and about other global conflicts, and how might his American identity be important at this time? We will be discussing this with 2 guests, and as always, I'll be keeping an eye on our chat to see what's happening there. Please post your comments and questions. Shout out to Jim, Seki, and Matt in the chat, and Seki with an early comment, quote, separate church is from the state is, well, I think they mean separation of the church and state is no longer relevant in this war as it keeps affecting our humanity. So that is one comment from somebody tuning in to us on YouTube. Thank you very much. Keep those comments and questions coming. We will try to pass as many of them to our guests. Now, I'm glad that you caught a glimpse of them, but we have Colleen Dulle, who is a journalist and host of the podcast Inside the Vatican, with us today on Sunday, and also Massimo Faggioli, professor of contemporary ecclesiology at Trinity College Dublin. Welcome to you both. I'm going to start with Colleen, and I want to ask you if you can just talk a little bit more about what Pope Leo has said about the war in Iran, directly or indirectly.
Sure, we've seen several comments from him, especially at these Angelus addresses. So we're going to see that probably in just a few minutes here, because those are given at noon Rome time on Sunday. The Pope also has been using other addresses to call for peacemaking or appeal to the consciences of leaders in some ways. And so on Friday of last week, for example, we saw the Pope speaking to priests and seminarians about the sacrament of confession. And he said, kind of asking rhetorically, do the Christians who bear responsibility in this war have the courage to go confess their sins? And that was seen widely as applying to the US, especially Catholics involved in making decisions about the war. Then also we saw him addressing on last Sunday, as you saw, the call for a ceasefire. And there have also been several other instances when he has talked about just a need for people to examine their consciences, direct appeals to world leaders. And then also, of course, we have to say that the Vatican has its own diplomatic core around the world. It has ambassadors, it has diplomatic relations with many countries. And so there are these back channels too that we assume that the Pope is using to advocate peace.
Colleen, I want to pull up that quote, that line that the Pope said about the conscience, because it is very interesting. You kind of have to infer that he's referencing the White House here. So let's pull that up if we can. And while that's being pulled up, I'll move on and ask Massimo a question, but do pull that up when we are able to. Massimo, the Pope has made similar statements on other global conflicts, on Ukraine, on Gaza, and I wonder whether his references to the Middle East with Iran substantively differ in any way from the previous conflicts he's commented on. Are there nuances with how he weighs in on each conflict?
Yes, there are nuances in every conflict. We saw already for the war in Ukraine that there were religious elements in this war, mostly intra-Orthodox between Moscow and Kyiv. But for the war in Iran and the consequences on Lebanon and on Israel, the religious intra-Christian and intra-religious Jewish Christian and Jewish Christian Muslim components are even more direct. And so that's why the situation is more delicate, because you see that this war has been waged by the US and Israel together, to say the least together. It's not clear who led that effort. And so the Vatican is incredibly aware of the risks of a return of anti-Semitism, not just in the fringes of our body politics, but also in governments, in parliaments. And so whatever the Pope says is now even more complicated because he's American, and this war sees the United States in a leading position. And because of the historical ties between the United States and Israel, and especially at this time between Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu, and so the war in Iran and the other consequences in the area are even more delicate, and every word is measured with incredible care, and we still don't know what kind of consequences this war will have on the credibility of Christianity worldwide, and of Catholicism, and even of the Vatican.
And I do think we have that quote. Let's throw it up there. I'm going to read through it. Pope Leo said, quote, "Do those Christians who bear grave responsibility in armed conflicts have the humility and courage to make a serious examination of conscience and to go to confession?" He's talking about Christians. If you look at the players in the regional conflict, Israel, Iran, and the United States, the majority of Christians are in the United States. Then you can infer that he's he's talking about the White House and asking some of the political leaders to go to confession. So quite a statement there. Now, given what's happening around the world, this is a question for both of you. Is there a feeling among leadership at the Vatican that Pope Leo must meet the moment? He's just started in this role, but I am recalling Pope John Paul II's visibility during the Cold War. Is that a conversation that the Vatican is trying to sort of walk and figure out to what extent they want the Pope to be out there weighing in on geopolitical issues? Let's go to Colleen.
Sure. It's an interesting question because the Vatican has such a robust kind of system of relations with other states, right? So the Pope is incredibly well advised in the diplomatic sphere. At the same time, he expressed pretty early on in his papacy that there was kind of a learning curve for him with taking on this position of world leader, right? He was okay with a lot of the other aspects of being Pope, but this one was a little challenging to him. Compared to past popes, we've seen quite a bit of restraint, I would say, from Pope Leo. For example, he seems to be leaving it to the local bishops in an area to speak out. And then when they have spoken out strongly, he gives kind of an echo. We saw that recently with what he said about the gamification of war, pretty much directly echoing something that came from a US cardinal on that. He really thinks that it's the role of the local bishops' conferences or the local bishops to be pushing against what their administrations are doing. And so, yeah, I would say, to what extent is that a conversation happening within the Vatican about what the Pope needs to be doing? It's difficult for me to say. But I would say that, he's stepping into kind of a stronger voice on this, as we saw in that clip you played from last week, where he directly appealed for a ceasefire directly to the leaders of this conflict.
Massimo, I'm just looking at comments in our chat on social media, and an account by the name of, a number, 12, I can't actually read that, but is asking about the Pope, inviting the Pope to mediate. My understanding is that there has been an offer by the Vatican to do so. Massimo, could you expound on that? To what extent the Vatican has tried to present itself as an option for the various parties to reach a ceasefire?
So this is nothing new. So we have seen these invitations, these appeals before, most recently for the war in Ukraine. The Vatican has been cautious and generous at the same time, offering some kind of role without really offering the Vatican as a stage, as a place for those mediations. We know that there are informal diplomatic agents who are close to the Vatican, for example, in the 1990s and even after the community of Sant'Egidio, which is based in Rome. I think there is a healthy reluctance of the Vatican to be directly involved in this until as long as the direct protagonists of this war, or some of them, have no intention to mediate. So that's the real problem, I think. So here the Vatican is an actor in the international community, but it's also the center of a Catholic community. And so dragging directly the Vatican into this could be counter beneficial, actually. And so there are great concerns about what kind of role to play here.
Just to follow up on Massimo's comments there, Massimo, you talk about reluctance, but I wonder how much power is part of that reluctance, not just because of a calculation that you don't want to get too, involved, but how much is it also because the Vatican doesn't kind of have the power or influence it used to have? This is not a church with an army as in the past. Massimo?
That is true. At the same time, we shouldn't forget that in 2025, the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, the Secretary of State of the United States, they were in the Vatican multiple times for Pope Francis' funeral, for the installation of Pope Leo. So they know And even other actors know that there's a certain power of that stage. The Vatican is very pragmatic in not promising the impossible. But they also know that there's nothing like the Vatican in the world of religions. Constantinople cannot play that role. Moscow cannot play that role. No place in the Muslim world can play that role. So there is a cautious pragmatism, and it's also because the Vatican can count only on its credibility. As you said, there's no army and there's no tariffs that the Vatican can impose on anyone, and so it's a very delicate asset to be managed.
Yeah, and talking about the Vatican's limits or powers and considerations, I just want to acknowledge Scott G's comment asking why would anyone listen to the Pope in relation to the extent of his power. We just saw some visuals, video footage of U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance meeting with the Pope. So I think this is a good opportunity to pivot a little bit and look closely at the United States now. Are there Vatican traditions? I mean, I believe there are Vatican traditions about a Pope not commenting too much on his country of origin. We know that, for example, Pope Leo turned down an invite extended by Vice President J.D. Vance to the United States to celebrate the country's 250th anniversary. And Pope Leo is not singular on this. I believe Pope Francis stayed away from Argentina for similar reasons. Are there parameters in which Pope Leo is working with within that on that front in terms of just not visiting the United States? Let's go to Colleen for that.
Sure. Yeah, it's normal Vatican practice for a pope not to visit his home country, or actually any country, in a year that they're having elections. And so because this year is a midterm election year in the United States, the pope will not visit. There was some talk about him coming perhaps to the UN in September in New York to address them. However, he is going to speak directly to the United States on July 3rd, so on the eve of the country's 250th anniversary, and that's because he's receiving an award from the National Constitution Center. It's their Liberty Medal. So that'll give him an opportunity to speak directly to the United States, and it'll be really interesting to see what he says. I imagine he'll not call out, particular names. That's pretty typical Vatican practice. Also, it's been standard, especially in recent years, for popes not to directly call out the aggressors in wars. They'll talk about the victims of the wars. They'll talk about the countries where they're happening. I think that's in an effort to keep open those diplomatic relations, those opportunities for dialogue. But yes, this call to go back to the confession thing was interesting because there are prominent Catholics, including Vance and also Marco Rubio, in the Trump administration. And, other Christians are not going to go to confession, right? So that's most likely an appeal to them.
I do want to talk about the leadership of the White House shortly, particularly the unusual number of Catholics in this White House. But first, I want to ask about ordinary American citizens. Quite a number of American Catholics voted for President Trump. Would it be fair to say that they feel at odds with the Pope's leadership or position on not just global conflicts, but on immigration, for example, which has become a major point of U.S. domestic division? This one to both Colleen and Massimo. I'm going to start with Colleen because I believe you are joining us from the United States. So over to Colleen, and I won't forget Massimo on this.
Sure. I would say generally there's kind of this attitude among U.S. Catholics of wait and see what this Pope does on war. So right now, these appeals for ceasefire, for dialogue, I think they're fairly uncontroversial. There's not a lot of public support for this war in the U.S. And at the same time, these numbers date to before the war, but the Pope's approval ratings among U.S. Catholics are rather high. So, I think it's difficult to say exactly where most Catholic Trump voters are falling on this, but those are kind of the general picture.
Massimo, your thoughts on this?
I do. I think Colleen is right. I also think here there's something different. So this is not like Afghanistan or Iraq when there are American troops on the ground. And so this is a war that is almost entirely about air control, which is not costing many US casualties. So this will have, I think, a different effect on the politics of those who voted for Trump and also on the politics of US Catholics who voted for Trump in November 2024, when the situation was very different and when maybe they did not expect the international situation to degrade in such a way, especially in these last 3 months. And so this is a second Trump presidency, but also the second year of the second Trump presidency is different from the first one. And so this will have to be studied carefully. I think that how the war will go will have an effect on the political positioning of Catholics, both those who voted for Trump and those who didn't vote for Trump.
Okay, let's talk about these leaders in the White House. Does what the Pope says matters to the Catholics, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Vice President J.D. Vance? But I also want to talk about those who are not Catholic but are invoking Christian rhetoric. We have Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth doing a lot of this, and I want to play this soundbite from him. He has called the Middle East conflict a, quote, holy war, and that must raise eyebrows with the Vatican. So let's have a listen to that.
So to the families who said, finish this, we will. And I say the same to every American who wants peace through strength. May Almighty God continue to bless our troops in this fight. And again, to the American people, please pray for them. Every day, on bended knee, with your family, in your schools, in your churches, in the name of Jesus Christ.
A question to both of you is, first of all, does what the Pope say matter to those Catholics, the prominent Catholics in the White House leadership? And also the reaction to Hegseth's comments just now. Let's go to Colleen and then Massimo.
Sure. Frankly, no, I don't think that it matters a lot to them. You know, we've seen J.D. Vance, for example, push back against things that the Pope has said previously. And so, no, I really don't know that they're listening. I think that, you know, perhaps Pope Leo sees it as his own role to appeal to the consciences of these folks and also to provide kind of a moral credibility for people who look at this war and say, you know, what should I think? And they look to the Pope and the Pope says, this is wrong. So he's using that moral authority. But in terms of what's going on in the hearts of, you know, folks in the administration, I guess I can't speak to that. I can only go on what they've said publicly.
Massimo, over to you.
I cannot speak on behalf of the Pope, but I know that in the Vatican they are horrified by this effort to Christianize the war. Paints with a very particular paint the whole of Christianity and also Catholicism, which is by now the single largest church in the United States. And so this is different from the vague Christian piety, which was typical of American foreign policy from Eisenhower in the 50s up to George Bush or even Obama. And so this is a more Christianist thing, which goes against what the Vatican has said in these last 30, 40 years about war. Now, again, Colleen is right. They're not paying attention to what Pope Leo is saying. But what's interesting is that they have stopped attacking the Pope, who was Pope Francis, for them was an anti-American, anti-Yankee. They know that they cannot do that now. So they're simply ignoring what Pope Leo is saying. And this is a problem for the Vatican because I spoke recently with a diplomat who told me, I've never seen anything about Pope Leo's choice to spend the 4th of July in Lampedusa, for example. So there is a difficulty of the Vatican, not just to reach the White House, which is impenetrable for other reasons, but also the media is reluctant to give the headlines to a Vatican that, for very reasonable reasons, doesn't want to mention the aggressor. But this is really muffling the message of the Vatican, even among diplomats. That's a serious problem, I think.
I want to, at this point, thank Colleen Dulle for joining us. We're very grateful, and we're glad that you were able to answer some questions from the chat. Massimo, I'm going to ask if you can stand by for a few minutes and keep you around to ask you a few additional questions. So thank you very much, Colleen. Now, geopolitical conflicts around the world are not the only challenge for Pope Leo. He also faces global challenges from big tech. The Vatican has been working on a set of moral principles to guide the development of artificial intelligence and other emerging technology, and that has received pushback from some major players, including Peter Thiel. The Silicon Valley billionaire is not a Catholic, but grew up in an evangelical Christian household and has strong views about the intersection of technology and religion. As a reminder, if you don't know, Thiel founded the payments app PayPal, helped launch a company called Palantir, a tech company that has contracts with the U.S. military and with ICE, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, at the center of America's currently unpopular immigration enforcement. And Thiel has been a key advisor and donor to President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance. So you can imagine the attention and concern when Thiel decided to hold a series of lectures on the Antichrist in Rome on the Vatican's doorstep. So I want to bring in, Massimo is here. I also want to bring in Fritz Espenlaub, who is a journalist and co-author of Deutschlandfunk's podcast series here in Germany. It's a multi-part series on Peter Thiel, including one episode examining Thiel's theory of the Antichrist. So welcome, Fritz.
Welcome. Hello. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes. I'm going to start by... like Peter Thiel holding these Antichrist lectures in Rome was definitely, surely a choice of two questions. Why did he do this in Rome? And what are his views of the Antichrist? I'm going to go to Fritz first, and Massimo, I might ask you a question and a follow-up.
Yeah, so Peter Thiel's fascination with the Antichrist has to be seen in the context of sort of his whole intellectual persona or his whole intellectual journey. He has always painted himself as a contrarian. He likes to provoke. He likes to raise eyebrows. So that I think is at least a part of the explanation why he did it particularly in Rome. He has held Antichrist lectures before in the Bay Area, I think also in Paris, if I remember correctly. And if you look at what exactly he says, like these are private lectures, these are not open to the public, but he's been on the record what he means by the Antichrist, and there have been reports of people participating in these lectures. So if you look under the hood, it's not, I think, that special. So it's not that he really wants to kind of like establish some sort of like serious theology there. In the end, it's him kind of like ranting against regulation a little bit, because at the end of the day, he's a venture capitalist, he's a tech person. Regulation is something that always is in conflict with technological revolutions, like right now, AI. There's a big discourse on AI regulation. And for Thiel, what he means by Antichrist is basically, he refers to some part of the Bible where I think the terms are the peace and safety of the Antichrist or something like that. So for him, the Antichrist is sort of like a stand-in for a desire of state institutions, mostly international institutions, to regulate technological innovation, which he's against.
Massimo, I've been seeing your facial expression during this explanation, so I'm curious what you're thinking, and what are the Church's views in terms of the Antichrist that differ from Peter Thiel's? You know, he came to these conferences were held in Rome, and a number of institutions that had previously believed to have been connected to these talks came out in Italy to deny any connections to these talks. What does the Vatican make of all of this, Massimo?
So yes, the choice of holding that lectures in the Vatican has a particular timing because there's an American Pope who's writing on AI and who has said a number of things already on the risk to create a post-human, anti-human world. And second, because this war in the Middle East that we're seeing has been called by many the first AI war. And so there's a particular timing. Catholic institutions were the ones who invited him. And so one in Italy and one which is located in the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., which is the University of the U.S. Catholic Bishops. But you're right, many other institutions in the Vatican and in Rome that are connected to the Catholic Church, anyone who could take distance from Thiel, they did take distance from Thiel. And so there's been a visible effort to not to be involved in this, but at the same time, a certain number of American Catholic clerics or students or institutions that are connected with U.S. Catholicism in Rome, so they have been invited. So they received personal invitations to go. And so there's been a gray area, let's say, between what the Vatican officially says and the reluctant skepticism or worse, and some circles of U.S. Catholicism that are more convincible,
right,
that are less skeptical.
And I just want to clarify, I believe I misspoke a little earlier. Thiel was in Rome only. He didn't wander into the Vatican, so want to make that super clear. Now, Massimo, I want to ask if you can expound a little bit more about the Vatican's artificial intelligence policy, because that seems to be touching on Peter Thiel's world and where he takes issue. Does the Vatican have an official policy on artificial intelligence? It's striking to me because AI is moving at such a rapid pace in terms of its development and changes. And the Vatican is not necessarily an institution one thinks of for its nimbleness, but I believe that the Vatican has been studying artificial intelligence development for the last few years. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure, they are studying this also because they were contacted by Silicon Valley in 2015. Silicon Valley told the Vatican, we're not going necessarily to follow your advice, but we want to know what you in the Vatican think about this. And so there is a reflection going on there. The Vatican is skeptical about this essentially because there's a view of technology that can be destructive of the personal dimension of the human life and of the interpersonal. And so there's no official policy to speak of, but there are already some documents. And I think that the next encyclical, the first one of Pope Leo, which will be published, it seems, shortly after Easter in April, will have a section on AI. And so there is a great distance between what Peter Thiel thinks that technology is the salvific source for our world, so that salvation will come from technology to solve everything, wars, environment, medicine, and the Vatican that has a deeply skeptical view about this godlike view of technology. So there is a real clash of visions about what is the role of technology in our world, in our humanity, and these are impossible to reconcile, I think.
Right. And speaking of Thiel in Rome, do we know where he ended up speaking, whether which venue was willing to actually host them? I don't know if either of you guys know and want to say something about it. Okay, shake from the head from Fritz and Massimo, do you know?
Yes. He spoke, in a Baroque palace in the city center, but Rome is very small, so you can see the Vatican from every window of an important Roman palace if you want to. So physically, there was a distance, but a number of American Catholic priests and seminarians showed up at that conference. So there was a distance, but not in a separate city that could have been like Milan is the city of technology in Italy, but they chose Rome for a reason.
Now, Fritz, Thiel's views seem to be pretty apocalyptic, and he uses strong Christian imagery in his language. I want to see if you can talk a little bit more about that. I know you touched on that a little earlier, but how extreme are his views?
That's a good question. So you have to, again, look at the context of the AI industry, of the tech industry. And the same schism that Massimo was talking about also exists there. There's broadly two camps, or have been two camps since the very beginning of the AI revolution. On the one side are those that really want to regulate it, that are very worried about to the regular person, very sci-fi sounding existential risks of like a rogue super artificial intelligence that's super powerful and threatens humanity. And on the other side are those like Peter Thiel that more emphasize the promises of the technology. And in this context, Thiel sort of like positions himself as a contrarian in contrast to the safety-minded people, to the ones that want to regulate AI, and says, no, well, you are talking about the AI apocalypse, but the real apocalypse would be if humanity stopped technological progress, if some sort of, it's not extremely coherent, because like there's a second scenario where he says, sometimes he talks about the apocalypse as this sort of like idea of a one world super state, like a super powerful European Union and mix of like European Union and the Chinese government that uses AI technology to kind of like remove individual freedoms. And he says this kind of like stagnation, this stasis is the real danger of AI. And the only way to not have that future is to full on press ahead with private tech development of this technology. So this is the broad context. I'm not sure really if there's any sort of actual what would be considered religious extremism to what Thiel is saying. Yes, he has a background in evangelical Christianity, but my reading, this is just my personal reading, is that he's much more interested in sort of like appearing as an intellectual sort of like innovator and being very interesting, and not just being a boring billionaire, a boring venture capitalist, but presenting novel, interesting ideas. And I think it's mostly an aesthetic choice to kind of like make a well-known criticism against regulation, put it into the words of the Antichrist. It just produces more headlines.
I want to just, I'm looking at chat to Dolph. This is a comment. This is their takeaway quote: for people like Thiel and Trump, money and power are their gods. Very provocative statement there. But speaking of provocative concepts and thinking, I think we're dancing around something that I want to ask the both of you, and I don't know who's comfortable to weigh in, but does, to a certain extent, if Thiel views technology in this positive light and views any institution that tries to create parameters around it as a negative, is he obliquely suggesting that institutions like the Catholic Church are kind of the Antichrist? I know that sounds pretty extreme. And Fritz, you've just said that he's much more of a tech entrepreneur and innovator. But I think that is something that we are dancing around. So Fritz, I don't know if you have anything to say. Massimo, I see a small smile on your face. So perhaps we go to Massimo and then we can go to Fritz for that second.
So I don't think Peter Thiel has called the Antichrist verbatim. But if we look at these last 15 years, more or less, there has been, coming from the United States, from Catholics and non-Catholics, really an ultra-futurist, postmodernist view of the Vatican, of the papacy, and of Pope Francis, but indirectly of Pope Leo, as people who are a danger to the future as they see it. And so there is so I agree that there is a weak theology there by Peter Thiel and so on, but there is a religious idea of technology, of industry, of the technical dimension. So it is anti-Christian, but it is religious. And so in this, it's very American. So this is something that could come only from America and from Silicon Valley, which is in some sense the new center of to understand the future, not just about technology, but also about religion. And so this fusion between religious expectations from salvation that can come only from technology, yes, indirectly is an indictment of the Vatican, of the church, of church leaders, of academic theology, of the whole world, I think.
Fritz, over to you.
Yeah, I would agree. I think he's definitely aware of this sort of like between the lines reading of kind of saying like, oh, people who want to regulate AI are my idea of the Antichrist. Oh, you're saying the Pope wants to regulate AI. Well, what does that make the Pope? So I don't think he would go out and say that explicitly, but again, it fits the pattern of Peter Thiel enjoying this role of contrarian, enjoying this role of provocateur. I'm sure he's aware of this between the line reading. And also maybe important context, he's not really alone in the tech world as noticing what Pope Leo says about AI regulation and kind of like being against that. Another very famous venture capitalist, Mark Andreessen, just shortly after Pope Leo came into office and made his first statements on AI, he went very publicly on Twitter, on X, and made basically fun of the Pope, ridiculed him, put him sort of like in a line with Greta Thunberg and other people that are regular subject of ridicule by some of these tech figures. So they definitely notice the Pope speaking about AI. And again, there is these two camps in the AI world. There's the AI safety crew, the people that want to really regulate AI very, very thoroughly. Those are I imagine the ones that reached out to the Vatican some years earlier, as Massimo has told. And then there's the other ones that position themselves directly against these people that want to regulate AI, and that felt sort of like rising waters after Trump came into office, after the new government was much more pro AI acceleration as opposed to AI regulation, which was the vibe just a couple of years earlier. And I think in this context, they also kind of like felt they have some sort of like cultural momentum to also be able to ridicule the Pope if he wants to regulate AI.
Massimo, really quick question, because you had talked about some people who were invited from the Catholic Church to this conference. Do we know anything about them? Are there those within the Catholic Church who support Thiel's views?
Well, I think so. We know because some Italian journalistic crews were outside that palace, and they interviewed very quickly some of those who were clearly dressed like Catholic priests or friars, and so we know that some of them attended. We also know that there are some important Catholic leaders, Catholic bishops in the US who are sympathetic or not opposed to this new kind of wave of fascination for technology, because they are heavily invested in that technology for their evangelization efforts, missionary efforts, and so on. And so we know that there is a certain sector of US Catholicism that is willing to hold their judgment and let some things happen, certainly on a different line compared to Pope Leo.
Okay. Well, I think we're close to wrapping up, so I want to give each of you a chance for final thoughts. Fritz?
So I did this whole podcast about Peter Thiel, right? And we were among the first, I think, journalists, at least in Germany, maybe even internationally, who really put a spotlight on his Antichrist ideas or these connections that he makes. Still to this day, I'm not quite sure 100% what's behind it. I think there's a certain percentage personal conviction, a certain percentage style, and just enjoying himself being in this role of this intellectual trailblazer. I think there's a certain also way of wanting to be different than previously the tech world has been very atheist. So there's also like this contrarianism towards that. And this all sort of like combines to what we're seeing right now. But I think if you really look under the hood, I would argue that just from a theological perspective, it's not that interesting. It's really just a tech billionaire who wants to make a lot of money and who enjoys being in this role of intellectual person.
Massimo?
Just two quick thoughts. First, the election of an American Pope broke a taboo, and that's very important, and we will figure out what that means. Second, we knew that having a Pope from the United States would always been very complicated. It is enormously more complicated now at the time of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth, and at the time also of Peter Thiel, of AI, who's really in charge of war and might be in charge of health. And for some people should be in charge also of the salvation of our souls. So this is an incredibly complicated time to be a pope from the United States in the Vatican.
And with that final thought, I will thank Fritz Espenlaub. Thank you very much. And thank you, Massimo Faggioli, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is all for this live stream on this Sunday, taking a closer look at Pope Leo and his involvement in geopolitics. We'll have other live streams in the future about the latest updates on Iran and more. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Melissa Chan. Have a good day.